Thanks, everyone, for coming out today. Good to see you all. We're going to have a discussion here about the future of the U.S. in the Middle East. I want to clarify at the start that we are, for purposes of this panel, defining the Middle East broadly to what is sometimes called the Greater Middle East, which includes the traditional Middle East and North Africa region, plus Middle East adjacent Afghanistan, because that does relate to some of the questions that we're going to discuss today. We're going to start with about 3 to 4 minutes from each of the panelists, who are going to talk about what they think the future of the U.S. in the Greater Middle East should be. And then I'm going to moderate a discussion among the panelists. So first, I am going to turn to my left, to Admiral Stavridis.
Thanks, Laurel. Great to be with everybody this morning. Thank you to Koch for bringing us all here, and welcome to the fellow panelists up here. It's a pleasure. Let me begin with stipulating that I yield to no one in my level of Middle East fatigue. I think anyone who's honest would say to themselves, any American who's honest, man, what are we still doing there? It is so difficult and challenging, and we've had so many missteps, errors, many self-induced, obviously. But having said that, I'm going to try and lay out a modest case for continued engagement in the Middle East at a very different level than we have indulged, and I think that's probably the right word, over the last 20 years. You know, 20 years ago, kind of at the start of the forever wars, occasionally you'd hear people say, hey, what we really need is a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. I think that's dead wrong. But I do think we need a plan. And bottom line up front, as we say in the military world, I think the plan that resonates for me as I look at the Middle East is not the Marshall Plan. It's Plan Colombia. So let me take my remaining 2 minutes and tell you kind of what I think of that. First of all, I do think you have to get over the bar of, does the Middle East matter? And I think it does, for a lot of fairly straightforward reasons. Energy, strategic minerals, again, greater Middle East, Afghanistan, a couple of $1 trillion of rare earth strategic minerals. So there's that resource piece. Population, it's 500 million people. It's very young. It's going to continue to have impact globally. Number 3, geography. You know, it sits in a pretty important corner, if you will, of the world between Africa, South Asia, Europe. I think you have to recognize the role of Israel in the importance of the region to the United States, our strongest ally in the Middle East and a traditional partner. I think you have to recognize constituencies here in America: Jewish American, Arab American, Afghan American, and of course the most important, Greek American, right on the edge of that region. And then lastly, I think there is a values component here, and this is always hard to quantify, but it's a part of the world where I think there could be engagement over time that would be beneficial to the value set that we espouse. So having said all that, and hopefully you can come at least part of the way with me that, yeah, it matters. Yeah, we're tired of being engaged there. What would a plan look like, or what could it look like? Again, not the Marshall Plan. Think of Plan Colombia. You know, before I was Supreme Allied Commander for 4 years, very focused on this region. Before that, I spent 3 years as Commander, U.S. Southern Command. I'm from Miami. I speak Spanish. I think I know that part of the world pretty well. I was kind of the owner and operator of the military portion of Plan Colombia for those 3 years. It, in my view, was pretty smart. It capped the military presence at 900. 1,800 boots on the ground if you want to give each of the 900 two. So 900, less than 1,000. It was very much an interagency effort. Soft power was a significant part of it. So was hard power, so was intelligence, so was values. It had many missteps and failures, like all of these plans, but it was modest in its ambitions and modest in its financial contributions, a few billion a year or two, and it was also bipartisan, came under both Democrat and Republicans. It was integrated, it led with intelligence, had a significant soft power component. It was international, regional. I think it's a pretty good model. And at the end of the day, if we took that theory of the case and applied it to the Middle East, and I'll conclude here, I think it would be a very light military footprint. You know, I think we've learned we don't need 150,000 troops in Iraq and 150,000 troops in Afghanistan. But how about 5,000 troops, strategically targeted, creating leverage through training, logistics, intelligence, presence in that sense? I think using maritime and air rotationally would make sense. And of course, the Navy's been doing this for years, so has the Air Force. I think that a plan for the Middle East would include some of those elements. What's NATO's role there? What kind of regional structures could be constructed? We could go on, but I throw that out as food for thought. Again, not a Marshall Plan, but a Plan Columbia, I think, would be a path forward to consider in this turbulent part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Rounding out the relatively engaged side of the panel here, over to Mike O'Hanlon.
Thank you, Laurel. Greetings, everyone. It's really a privilege to be part of this conversation, to be teamed up with Admiral Stavridis, but really to be teamed up with everyone, because I think we all are looking for ways to minimize the U.S. military role in the broader Middle East, and then there are debates about what does that mean and how far can we go down that path. I think the best thing I can do to complement the outstanding opening by my teammate here is to do a little bit of a thought experiment on what might happen if we went too low, in the interest of setting up a little bit of a debate and perhaps sharpening where there may be some points of disagreement here. By the way, I hope very much that in the follow-on we get into a discussion of what I think is the most important policy choice for the United States going forward, which is not whether to have 3,000 here and 4,000 there in various countries as we sort of do today, but whether to use force against Iran if it breaks out of its obligations under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. And by the way, I'm not necessarily going to be on the pro-intervention side of the equation when we get to that debate, if we do. But let me say why I think it's good to have still 2,000 Americans in Iraq. And I'm not going to relitigate the Iraq War debate, of course, but I want to talk about where we are in 2021. And in 2021, we've got roughly 2,000 forces. President Biden scaled those back modestly from about 2,500 and redefined the mission, which is cosmetic and symbolic and really trying to play the Iraqi politics right, because as you all know, in Iraqi politics, you don't want to be too pro-Iranian, but you also don't want to be too pro-American. And I think part of our job in Iraq is to try to give the Iraqis an alternative to Iran so they don't feel coerced and bullied, and also to try to keep the sectarian tensions from exploding the way they did in 2012, 13, 14, when after our complete departure, Prime Minister Maliki governed like his inner self most wanted to, and he expunged and often tried to arrest very good Sunni leaders and created the backdrop against which ISIS could rise and against which jihadism could return to Iraq. My sense is that 2,000 Americans is an important hedge against that same kind of turn in Iraqi politics. It's not a guarantee, and it comes with danger. Those 2,000 forces could be attacked again. They've mostly been relocated to parts of the country where they're safer than they were previously, a little more distant from urban areas. But obviously there are enough militias, often armed by Iran, inside of Iraq with enough long-range weaponry that they can sometimes take shots at us even if we're fairly remote in the country. So there are dangers. And I'm not going to guarantee that 2,000 U.S. troops puts Iraqi politics on a better course. But I do think the current way in which the new leadership, relatively new leadership in Iraq, is trying to navigate this complex demographic and strategic environment, complex sectarian demographics within its own country, is much better than anything like what we saw a decade ago after the U.S. pullout. So to my mind, helping with training, mentoring, helping Iraqis appeal to the better angels of their nature, if you will, by giving them an outstanding military with which to interact, with which to cooperate and perhaps emulate, is a far better approach than going to zero. And so I'm just going to leave you with that thought experiment. We can talk about other countries. I think, as you know, today's Middle East presence is sort of 5,000 here, 5,000 there. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, like in Djibouti or Iraq or Turkey. That's sort of the mix. And as much as it's a fair amount, it's still 50, 60,000 total U.S. troops when you add in typical Navy presence. And depending on how you calculate, CBO's numbers are in the range of somewhere around 50, 60 billion a year in cost for this presence. But the numbers can be debated, and there are other arguments that it's in roughly half of that. Either way, it's not cheap, and I'd rather the forces be home. It's not like being based in Europe or Japan, where the troops actually, I think, are fairly happy to be deployed abroad. Most of our forces in the Middle East, I think, would rather be home and would be safer home. But when I think about Iraq, and I do the thought experiment over the last 10 years in particular, I still think we've more or less found the least bad option. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to turn to the other side of the dais here. And first, Andrew, over to you.
I think it's time for us to render a verdict on this entire misadventure and to finesse the issue, as our adversaries are inclined to do, I think gets in the way of the accountability which is overdue. My telling of the story goes this way. With the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine back in 1980, the United States began an effort to fix this greater Middle East. Now, let me acknowledge that fix is not a term found in the standard lexicon of political science. But I am not a political scientist, as I was reminded yesterday evening listening to John Mearsheimer talk about China. In practice, the effort to fix the region has found expression in relying on American military power to punish, contain, eliminate rogue regimes, and/or to liberate, democratize, and spread human rights. Methods employed have included sanctions, punitive strikes, invasion, occupation, pacification, nation building, and assassination. In my judgment, successes have been few in number and ephemeral, whereas costs have been stratospheric. I think the latest estimates of the cost of war project that we spent something on the order of $7 trillion in the region since 9/11. I think there's an estimate of another trillion or $2 billion, trillion dollars that will be required for veterans' costs over the next couple of decades. So what to do? I think what to do begins with candidly acknowledging that this has been from the outset a misbegotten endeavor, and therefore we should end it forthwith. What does that mean in practice? First, I think it means we begin by acknowledging that the essence of the Carter Doctrine was wrong. The Persian Gulf does not constitute a vital U.S. national security interest, and we should therefore end U.S. military presence in the region. Not 1,200 boots on the ground, 0 boots on the ground, 0 U.S. fighter bombers flying over the ground. That doesn't mean we ignore the region. We do have interest there, if not vital. Therefore, we should rejuvenate American diplomacy, which has been largely sidelined, with an eye toward determining, not determining the fate of the region with U.S. military power, but aiming to persuade nations in this region that they actually have an interest in mutual coexistence. Not easy to do, but it seems to me that the endeavor that we've been engaged in for the past 4 decades has clearly shown that there is no military solution as we have attempted to implement one. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you. It's hard to follow 3 very knowledgeable people, especially folks who have written about and spoken about the Middle East and worked in the Middle East, in the case of Admiral Stavridis in particular. My remarks brief today are mostly based on a paper that I co-authored with my colleague Robert Manning at the Atlantic Council, published back in June. One of our reality checks on U.S. military policy in the greater Middle East. And my comments are also informed by the work of many folks, including people in this room, like, Phil Auerswald's written about this, Justin Logan, Darrell Press, Eugene Goltz, and others. I don't want to rehash all that, though, because when I hear people talk about engagement in the Middle East and implying that the military component of U.S. engagement in the Middle East is a critical part of that, I'm skeptical. So I'm at the New American Engagement Initiative, so we think about engagement, we try to think about it all the time. And I think that the premise of the U.S. military posture in this region has been that the military component is essential to U.S. engagement in the region. And I think that is a claim worth scrutinizing. In my brief and undistinguished naval career, I managed to make it to the Persian Gulf, well, the region twice. 2 times through the Suez Canal, once all the way into the Persian Gulf. That was 30 years ago. And as Andy points out, the Carter Doctrine takes us back at least 10 years before that. And so, as a thought experiment, the way that Mike framed it, I think it would have been worthwhile to ask 40 years ago, what would we like to see with respect to U.S. interests and U.S. values in the region 40 years after the Carter Doctrine was promulgated? And also as a thought experiment, what would we like to see the region look like 10 or 15 or 20 years from now based on different approaches? Now, of course, the challenge with this is that we can't actually, it's just a thought experiment, right? We don't have the benefit of controlling variables and all that good stuff. But I think as a thought experiment, it is hard to imagine that anyone would argue that U.S. interests and values have on net been advanced by the U.S. military presence in the region. I think that's a hard case to make. Admiral Stavridis calls it exhaustion or fatigue, but I think it's worse than that, because I think that the U.S. military presence has crowded out other forms of constructive engagement. It has crowded out diplomacy. It has crowded out trade. It has crowded out cultural exchange, other forms of engagement that would be conducive both to U.S. interests and U.S. values. It's that part that I just don't see happening right now. I think this region is trapped. It is lagging badly behind the rest of the world. And we have to ask the question, why? And we have to wonder whether or not the U.S. military presence in the region might actually be holding it back. Now, in 2 particular ways, and I'll stop. One, Andy already alluded to. Helping to convince the countries in the region that some form of peaceful coexistence is in their interest is, I think, a U.S. interest and a global interest. Has the U.S. military presence mostly discouraged or mostly encouraged that mindset? I think it's the former. I think it has discouraged that kind of sense of peaceful coexistence. 2, has the U.S. military presence generally advanced the cause of liberalism and human rights in the region? I think it is hard to point to any examples when it has, and several examples when it has had the opposite effect. So I take this charge very seriously about where the U.S. military posture and what it should look like, and I agree with Andy that the case for even a small presence is slim, but I also take seriously Admiral Stavridis' call for a different form of engagement. And I ask all of you to consider what would that look like, and does that engagement actually hinge on the presence of a few hundred or a few thousand or tens of thousands of U.S. troops in the region? Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to direct some questions to each of the panelists, but I hope that you'll also feel free to respond to each other as you answer these questions, or direct the conversation in a different direction if you want to. I'm going to go in reverse order here and start with a question to Chris. You talked about the limited results that have been produced through the American military presence. But isn't there a different way to think about a slimmed down, as it is now, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, a slimmed down American military presence in the Middle East, a little bit involved in multiple places with more limited goals? Why isn't that useful as an insurance policy? Even if you can't prove that there are tangible results, isn't this insurance against worse results in a different direction? And related to that, you've suggested that military presence crowds out diplomatic presence, and or diplomatic activity, and that should be more at the forefront. But isn't there a need for the either potential use of force or the actual use of force as a backup to diplomacy to make it more effective? Taking Michael Hanlon's example, if it's an American interest to prevent too much Iranian influence in Iraqi politics, are you really going to do that just through diplomacy, or is that just not really an interest at all?
I think, Laurel, that I love the frame of an insurance policy because it hinges on the extent to which we value or the value that we place on our interests in the region, and whether or not that particular insurance policy is contrary to our values. I think both of those things matter. Admiral Stavridis said that, how much does this region matter? And he used Plan Colombia as an example. Actually, I'd never thought of it that way, but I would say that Colombia matters a lot more to the United States than the Persian Gulf does. And so the insurance policy question is, what are you insuring against? How serious is that threat? I'm not convinced that people in Northern Virginia need earthquake insurance, but I think that folks in California might. I'm not sure that folks in Kansas need hurricane insurance or flood insurance. Some people in Kansas need flood insurance. But you understand what I'm saying here. It's like the insurance policy question assumes that the thing you are insuring against is at a very, very high value to you, and the risks of adopting that policy reduce the risk. But I see instead a policy that has increased the risk to the United States. And so it's what kind of policy are we adopting, and does it actually reduce those risks? So as I see it, even a small presence, a small military presence, comes at the expense of diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange. And those are the things that I think we should be investing in, and those would reduce the actual risk at a far less cost.
May I add something?
Please, and can I add a question for you, and you can combine these as
You're in
you
charge.
like. I welcome your response to that, but I'm also interested in hearing you probe a little bit why what you are recommending is not the apparent direction of travel of American policy. If the U.S. is still overextended in the Middle East and should have zero boots on the ground, as you're advocating, is the fundamental problem one that that is going to be resolved? Is the problem not a question of not having good strategy, but of a political and cultural addiction to American primacy? Are we too addicted to military solutions to really change?
Yes. To expand on that only slightly, but let me go back to Chris's point. I mean, I would argue that U.S. military presence in the region is a provocation. I don't care if it's 2,000 troops or 20,000 troops or 150,000 troops, but the fact that we assert the prerogative of establishing and maintaining forever a U.S. military presence in the region is itself a contributing cause to the problem. Hence, my argument, I think Chris's argument, that zeroing out that presence is essential. Now, but your question does indeed, I think, get to the larger question, which looks beyond the greater Middle East, of the militarization of U.S. policy, which I think, we talked about this yesterday slightly, that I think does can be traced to attitudes that were widespread in the immediate wake of the Cold War, the claims of the United States being the indispensable nation, the assertion that we were now the sole superpower, the conviction, particularly after the Iraq War of 1991, that somehow we had achieved mastery over war, and therefore military power was an instrument that we could now put to use. I think all events have demolished all those. And yet, as somebody who lives in Walpole, Massachusetts, not in Washington, it seems to me that those attitudes still persist here within the Beltway. Again, going all the way back to my original point, and that is that there is a need to render a definitive judgment on a major policy undertaking that commenced 40 years ago, that, in my judgment at least, has achieved nothing that is positive. And that only if we are willing to render that verdict does it become then possible to revisit some of the assumptions underlying the claims to our indispensability, underlying the militarization of U.S. policy that has become so much of a hallmark of our actions in the world over the last several decades.
Who can render that judgment? I mean, I don't see it in Congress, where I don't think it's just in the Beltway that you have this addiction to military primacy and military means.
No, the American...
I'll give a smart alecky answer.
Okay.
The Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft
Thought you were going to say
can
the
render
American
that
people
judgment.
can
Do you
render
have
that
do you have a
judgment.
website, Andy, you can share with us?
Yes, no, I think more seriously, yeah, one of the characteristics of our military engagement in the greater Middle East, and many people have commented on this, is that the American people have been disengaged, have not paid attention, read about the costs and the casualties in the newspapers, may sympathize with the troops for their sacrifices, but aren't seriously attending to what we have done in that region for the past several decades, and have not seriously attended to the costs. Again, I'm not a political scientist. I don't have some grand theory of the rise of Trump and Trumpism, but so I am certainly in the camp that would insist that the failures of U.S. military policy in the greater Middle East help to create the conditions giving rise to Trumpism and to Trump and to the challenges to our constitutional order that I think probably trouble almost everybody in this room.
Okay, so Mike, we have some big questions on the table, whether there has been failure of American policy in the Middle East, and whether that needs to be confronted and judged, whether there are risks that are worth investing and insuring against? Should we be paying that insurance premium, whether a military presence is a provocation? But you've put also then a very specific question on the table in your opening comments related to Iran and the risks of an Iranian dash to a nuclear weapon if the diplomatic effort, which I would say is backed up by more than diplomacy, or the threat of more than diplomacy, to reignite the Iran nuclear deal if that fails. So how do you square these big questions we've been talking about with the very precise questions that American policymakers, who don't sit around thinking about grand strategy, but do think about these kinds of more immediate risks, how do you put that together?
Thanks, Laurel. So let me think through, again, in thought experiment mode, two scenarios with Iran. One would be if Iran gets the bomb and we are there, and one if Iran gets the bomb and we aren't there. And I think that Iran may get the bomb irrespective, so I think it's worth thinking through both of those. First of all, I would not use military force against Iran to try to prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon under almost any imaginable circumstances that I can think of, because I don't think you can contain the military engagement to a surgical strike, a bad term that has a bad history. And I think that realistically speaking, we're not going to be able to prevent long-term acquisition of an Iranian nuclear weapon with that strategy anyway. And Iran, of course, is 3 times the size and population of either of the countries that we've invaded in the Middle East in the last 2 decades. So that, to me, is just a foreboding kind of scenario to think about. But part of the reason why I can live with it, now getting to my other thought experiment, in a worst case, is because I do believe that the United States, working with partner nations in the Middle East, can deter the complete collapse of the region in the event that Iran gets the bomb. In other words, I think we can help reassure the key U.S. allies in the region to the point where they will, for the most part at least, not pursue a nuclear weapon. It's always difficult and dangerous to predict the future, and maybe the Saudis will try to get one if the Iranians do. But on balance, you're not going to see a half-dozen countries feel they need to develop their own crash nuclear weapons programs or somehow start a war with Iran before Iran can build up to a larger arsenal, because those countries, for the most part, see that the United States can help them deter cross-border Iranian aggression. Iran with the bomb is dangerous, but probably manageable if there is a security community backstopped by the United States. In the absence of an American commitment to the region and to key countries, but in the presence of an Iranian nuclear weapons program that's out of control, I believe you will see several countries in the region pursue nuclear weapons and probably see Iran be even more aggressive in its encounters and its ambitions towards those countries. And as bad as the Middle East is today, it can always get worse. And let's not forget that there are some things about the Middle East that we have helped secure that they're better than the alternative. I'm not going to defend the price tag. I'm not going to defend the cost in blood and treasure. I'm not going to say U.S. policy has generally been good. I'm not going to say the World War I, Versailles, Sykes-Picot efforts were good. I mean, there are a lot of things that screwed up the Middle East over many decades and centuries. But I do think that we could imagine a Middle East that is a whole lot worse, because at least today, there is not, for the most part, interstate aggression. There is still a fair amount of oil and gas production in a world that still needs Middle East oil and gas. We have several countries that are key American friends and allies that are relatively secure, like Israel, Jordan, Oman, some of them showing progressive and positive movement on political reform. I take the challenge, by the way, that we need a better vision for how to get out of the Middle East. Unlike in Europe and East Asia, I don't want to stay there forever. I think we do need a vision for how to get out. And I don't really have that to offer you today. I acknowledge my frustration in not having a grand strategy for an eventual American departure. But in the meantime, rapid departure has already been tried and tested in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2011 and 2021. I don't like the looks of that much either. I think if we do that in the Persian Gulf region, with Iran bent on nuclear ambitions, we're really asking for a lot more trouble.
Admiral, does Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban's takeover, the return to the status quo ante after 20 years of effort, prove the point made on the other side of the dais here of lack of results, of failure of American military presence being more of a provocation than a solution? And if it does that signify anything for the greater Middle East, or is Afghanistan sui generis?
I think it certainly supports the frustration that we all feel with the events in the Middle East. I will point out in the modest good category that our presence led to literacy for millions of young Afghan men and women, boys and girls. I think the Taliban will see. We'll see what happens in Afghanistan. They're dealing with a very different Afghanistan. But absolutely, it is a frustrating, deeply painful episode. And exactly as Andy and Chris said, it leads you to the conclusion that what was the point of it all? So sure, I'll give you that one easily. Here's where I'd like to kind of direct our thinking. It's that we ought to be suspicious of absolute solutions. And if the absolute solution is no U.S. military presence in the Middle East, like tomorrow, I don't go along with that. I don't think it makes sense. I think that's absolutist thinking. And it's kind of like an on and off switch. It kind of presupposes that our problem only has two settings: 300,000 U.S. troops in the region or zero. I just don't think that makes a lot of sense. So instead of a on and off switch, I propose we have a rheostat, like the dimmer in your dining room where you get to kind of dial it up or dial it down. So I would say, yeah, dial it down significantly. And by the way, kind of done that ashore. I think we could have a fulsome discussion about the size, presence, and activities of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, which used to be, during Carter's time, 3 ships. Today, it's a massive battle fleet. So that would be a good place to have that conversation about the rheostat, having already dialed down the ashore component. Rotational, again, is where I would kind of direct our thinking here. And the second macro point I would make, back to Plan Colombia, I would say, and maybe everyone up here agrees with this, we will never deliver security solely from the barrel of a gun. We will never deliver security solely from the barrel of a gun. But there are times when you need a few guns. Joe Nye said that soft power without the ability to apply hard power is no power. And I think that's probably true. So I'm all for continuing to dial the rheostat down, but I am very much for doing it gently as it goes down, rendering some judgments. Andy is absolutely correct. There should be significant accountability for the mistakes and missteps of these 20 years. But I don't think that requires us to begin by simply pulling every U.S. military person out of the greater Middle East. Last thought. When I was at Southern Command, what I learned, I went there as a 4-star officer, and I had at that time 33 years in the military. And I was pretty much a hard power guy. I was, okay, whistle up the tomahawks. What I learned at Southern Command is that it really is a team sport with the interagency. That was Plan Colombia. It was state. It was defense. It was development from AID. It was FBI. It was DEA. It was CIA. It was Treasury. It was free trade agreements. It was economics. It was all of that. You got to approach it in that way. So yeah, let's dial it down for sure. Let's take that kind of interagency approach. Let's work with our allies, partners, and friends. And I think we can have the kind of modest successes that we have seen in Colombia or the Balkans which were on fire 20 years ago, looked a lot like Syria today, 8,000 men and boys killed at Srebrenica. How did we solve that to the degree we have solved it? The Balkans are still very difficult. But we're not seeing hundreds of thousands of people pushed across borders. We're not seeing massacres like Srebrenica. When the Serbs want to talk to the Croats about something, they don't grab their hunting rifles and head out the door. They call Brussels and ask for mediation. How did that happen? It happened by the judicious application of force alongside the development, the economics. And by the way, we've been dialing that presence down. When I took over as Supreme Allied Commander, I had 15,000 troops in Kosovo. That's down to about 1,500 today, 95% reduction. We can do this. We have to do it using that rheostat approach, that interagency approach, the international approach, and we need to avoid the arrogance and the hubris, which have, in many cases, as Andy and Chris correctly point out, led us to tragic missteps.
Laurel, can I jump in? I know
Yeah,
Andy
I'd
wants
like
to jump
you
in
to-
too. Andy, you're going to take this one?
I'd like you both to react to a couple
I was
of
about to
things
ask the
here.
Admiral a question, but if you want to go.
Well, I just on the question of hard power, I think we're missing in this discussion the premise of my and Andy's argument is that a permanent presence, both a permanent rotation of ships in the region and the permanent emplacement of personnel on land, is critical to the ability to project hard power. That's not true. That's not accurate. Ships move, planes fly, people move. And the ability to project hard power does not depend upon a physical presence 24/7, 365 days a year in a particular place. On the contrary, leaving those forces in those places exposes them every single day to enormous risks. And when any one of those incidents, God forbid, occurs, then we will be involved, whether it's in our interests or not. So we have to be crystal clear on that point.
Well, so, and for
If I
both of-
could just respond to
Yeah.
that, I'll use a nautical metaphor. You know, we don't tear down a lighthouse because there haven't been a whole series of ships running on the rocks. So my point is, again, I'm all about rotational activities in and out of the region. Again, I don't think we need massive footprint, but I think, as Michael said quite eloquently a few moments ago, that ongoing presence, that interaction, that does matter in my view.
And I mean, to follow up on that, why isn't the rheostat approach the prudent approach? Because it is more subtle than a complete change to American deployments overseas and the American posture in the region. Why is a more dramatic and presumably abrupt change to American posture better than the rheostat?
Well, I'll repeat myself. But again, it seems to me that it is very important for us to reach a definitive judgment on the folly that we have been engaged in. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that we're going to do the rheostat, then I think that avoids that judgment. But if I may, I'd like to press Admiral Stavridis a bit on the Columbia comparison. And what I would like you to talk about, if you could, is the extent to which particular conditions in Columbia contributed to success there. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about history, culture, religion, and to what extent history, culture, and religion in a different part of the world, like the greater Middle East, makes the Columbia comparison either viable or perhaps questionable.
Well, first of all, Andy, as you and I both know, we start all of this through what you have devoted much of your life to, which is after an extraordinary and distinguished career as a military officer, you became a scholar a writer, a thinker. And I think that we begin all of this, and we should begin, with the humility to accept our lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of language capability. And that is your point, absolutely extant in the Middle East. We fail to appreciate, and again, I'm Greek American, so I'm allowed to use Greek words, hubris. Colombia, yeah, it was a more fertile soil for this approach. It didn't have the kind of Sunni Shia conflicts baked into it. Although, interestingly, if you look at the Christian faith, we've seen that movie before with the Wars of the Reformation. Again, that's your point. These internecine religious wars can go on and on and on. So I take your point that Colombia is not, in any sense, a perfect analog. I look at it more as a guidepost to a better sense of thinking than we undertook in our arrogance when we deployed the first time. And I hope we can learn from that. And by the way, it's not just Colombia. We should look, I think, quite seriously at the Balkans. We should look at places where we've been successful. For example, I would argue in the Middle East in defending Kuwait, where I believe you served. And that turned out to be, in my view, a smart foreign policy move. And then we did an even smarter thing and got out. And so there are positive lessons to be learned alongside these very negative ones that we need to draw as well.
Mike, if I could turn to you for a second. You know, the Biden administration has made the argument that part of the reason, or maybe even the main reason, for pulling out of Afghanistan is to be able to concentrate its resources on competition with China. Now, you have been advocating for a, if I'm understanding, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for some downsizing of the commitment. I know you were against the withdrawal from Afghanistan, at least in the way and timing that it happened. I think you are somewhat aligned with this rheostat concept here. But is what we've seen in this downsizing of American engagement in the Middle East not really about adopting a new strategic approach, but simply about enabling the U.S. to double down on military competition with China, so that it's not really a new rethinking of the role of the militarization of American national security policy and foreign policy, but it's just shifting it to another theater of competition?
Thanks, Laurel. Let me just say that it makes me nervous when we talk this way because I don't want us to overdo the military competition with China. So I'm not shifting sides here. I think that there's a good chance the Admiral might agree with me on this. And again, we're all after a new understanding of American foreign policy, even though the debate format's useful for identifying some points of tension. But just two embellishments or further elucidations of that point. I have to say in passing, Laurel wrote a fantastic book on what might have been a rough vision for a power-sharing effort in Afghanistan, and I do regret that the peace process never gave that set of ideas a serious chance. To me, it's one of the most creative and serious efforts, by far and away the most creative and serious that I saw, so I wanted to compliment Laurel on that publicly, because, again, the process didn't play out long enough for that book to get quite as much real-world pragmatic attention as it deserved. Full stop. China. I think that rather than debate too much whether we should have 5,000 or 7,000 or 0 troops in Kuwait, I'm much more concerned today about showing restraint in how we think about China and specifically Taiwan scenarios. And a lot of my writing the last 3 to 4 years has been trying to think through how we should try to use an economics warfare first strategy in response to many types of Taiwan crises. Because I think this notion that if we somehow just double down, maybe get rid of strategic ambiguity, adopt the Mattis National Defense Strategy, keep our investments at 3 to 5% real growth in the defense budget, somehow we can restore the kind of conventional military dominance that gave us the ability to deter any and all Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Those days are gone for good, and that kind of story is a pipe dream. We are not going to restore the dominance we once had, and if China starts doing things like blockade or limited missile strikes, cyber attacks, I'm not talking so much about an all-out immediate attempt at an invasion, which I see as less likely. But if they use blockade and such means, I think we need an asymmetric response. So to the extent we think harder about Taiwan scenarios, then maybe de-emphasizing the Middle East can help. To the extent we believe that taking a few thousand ground troops out of Afghanistan is going to improve or restore our military dominance against China, we're wrong, and that's dangerous thinking.
Can I?
Please, and I think we just have a few minutes left, so I want to turn to each of you to have whatever concluding thought you have, responding to each other, or just something you haven't had a chance to say. So
I got
over to
like
you.
30 seconds to respond to O'Hanlon.
Sure.
Our side also admires the moderator. So don't think you're scoring points.
Note that down. Well, as you have the floor, over to you for any concluding thoughts.
You want me to go? Why don't I go first?
Go
I'll
ahead.
go first real quick, because I just want to thank everyone for participating. Admiral Stavridis, Mike, great to see you, and thanks for doing this, and always great to be on the stage with Andy. And thanks to Laurel for moderating. But I think that getting at the assumptions that have undergirded U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East in the past and are likely to in the future is absolutely critical. This is what we do at the New American Engagement Initiative. And Mike asserted that U.S. presence had contributed to peace in the region, maintained oil production at a steady state, and produced modest liberalization. Is that a fair characterization, Mike, of your claim?
It's close enough with 2 minutes left. I'll
Fine.
let you have it.
And that's a perfectly reasonable assertion, but I think it is worth scrutinizing that assumption and asking whether or not there would have been more peace, more oil production, and greater liberalization in the region in the absence of the U.S. policy of the last 40 years.
My concluding comment is that we need to pay more attention to history. Admiral Stavridis said that, paying tribute, I think, to the Gulf War of 1991, we won and we got out. Well, we didn't get out. We maintained a substantial U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of that conflict. Maintaining that was a provocation. It was a provocation, among others, to Osama bin Laden, and was at least a contributing cause to the train of events that ended up with 9/11. So the history matters, and I think that as a non-political scientist, we need to pay greater attention to the details of the historical record.
Thank you.
I will simply pick up the thread of history and tell you on the ancient Greek temple at Delphi, there are two phrases carved which the Greeks would tell you encompass all human wisdom. One is know thyself. I think that applies across the thread of our conversation here. And the other is all things in moderation. That's pretty good advice for foreign policy. Thanks.
Mike, the last word.
And I'm going to finish on Taiwan, even though we're not supposed to.
That's okay.
Because
I'm interested.
I'm nervous about it. And I think that it's worth a debate about whether we should feel a commitment to Taiwan. And I know a lot of folks in this room and in the broader offshore balancing community would say, no, it's not worth a military commitment. However, I'm not sure that you're going to win that debate in time. So I think personally, at least as important of a debate is how we can think of non-escalatory and probably economic warfare first strategies for how to deter crises between China and Taiwan. I think we're overdue for this debate. And rather than get back to strategic ambiguity or not, commitment or not, we should think about a strategy that allows us to have Taiwan's back, but in a way that minimizes the chance of all-out war against China. Thank you.
I think we've all agreed that there have been mistakes made by the U.S. in the Middle East, even if we've disagreed on what exactly the mistakes are. And I think we can end on the thought that we should not transpose those mistakes to other theaters without subjecting to close examination what we've done and why. So thank you, and I think we've ended exactly on time, and thanks to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Good job, partner.
There will be a